everybody. So in your world, today is Friday. So, sorry, I was wrong. Today is Thursday, February the 17th. But in my world, I'm making this video on Tuesday, February the 15th. Little John is doing well. We got to go home on Sunday the 13th, but then Monday the 14th, we had to bring him back. He started running a fever. So we're camped out here, hopefully get to go home on Wednesday the 16th. So for y'all, it is Thursday, February the 17th, and we are starting off today with chapter 10, The Age of Jackson. So we're going to go through these notes today. Tomorrow you're going to watch a movie about Davy Crockett, and his life fits into this. You will see Andrew Jackson in that video. So I'll kind of help put some of the things we talk about here into perspective. All right, so we're going to start off looking at Jackson. So although the period from 1820 to 1840 is often named for Andrew Jackson, the Age of Jackson, it was well underway before Jackson's 1829 inauguration. From the beginning of the century, there was a lot of cross currents in the political and the social seas. There was a lot that was going on. There was differings of opinions, and they were very strong opinions. You may see some of that today. It was a lot of the same turmoil that was going on. Jackson would ride into office on this turbulence crest, but the age was shaped by forces much larger than any men. Widespread currents of nationalism, which is a love for your country, sectionalism, which is a love for your area, such as loving Georgia, and the democratization originated before Jackson's presidency. So we're going to look at some of those cross currents, some of these things that made this time in history just so turbulent. The years immediately following the War of 1812 saw a growing spirit of nationalism. This was a time where there was a lot going on in America. There was new states that were added. There was this sense of pride in the country. People were proud to be American. There was a lot of expansion going on. All these 7 states that were added came out of the Louisiana territory. You had Louisiana, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri. And then there was lots of new men. There was a new generation of men that came along in the politics. You had men such as John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun. They all had the vision for a strong, prosperous America. At the heart of the new nationalism was a concern for the economic strength of the nation. And Henry Clay was an advocate for an economic nationalism called the American system. His system had 3 parts: protective tariffs. Protective tariffs are designed to protect the home industry. It is a large tax on imported goods to protect the home industry. So people were more likely to buy goods from home versus overseas. Renewal of the national bank was another part of his American system. And then finally, internal improvements. Those internal improvements were things such as roads, bridges, canals, physical things that you can see that would make our country better. So let's look at the protective tariff here. Jefferson's embargo that we talked about in chapter 19 and the trade disruptions brought by the War of 1812 had the unexpected benefit of stimulating the growth of American manufacturing. So this was an important step towards economic independence from Europe. So a tariff, what is a tariff? We're talking about a protective tariff, but what is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imported goods, goods that are coming in from another country. And a protective tariff is an unusually high tariff designed to shield a nation's manufacturers from foreign competition. We talked about that a little bit earlier. The Tariff of 1816 was America's first such protectionist legislation. It was legislation that was designed to protect America. So why? British factories more advanced than America at the time were the problem. They were a lot better than American factories. They'd been around longer. So they were able to produce things cheaper. So of course, people are going to buy them from overseas. But if you don't start supporting the American factories, you're not going to be able to grow those factories. So they needed to be able to produce American goods cheaper. So the only way they could do that at the time was to make the foreign goods more expensive. Although it encouraged some American economic growth, it increased the sale of American products. It meant higher prices for customers. So while it's protecting the industry itself, it's hurting the consumers because they're having to pay higher prices. And as they're having to pay higher prices, they've got to get that money from somewhere else. Before we go on to the national bank, there's another type of tariff. One type of tariff is called a revenue tariff, and it is a lower tariff that is designed specifically to raise funds for a country. Most of the people in all the states, South and North, supported a revenue tax, a revenue tariff, being able to raise money for the country. It was this protective tariff that caused problems for many years, especially in the South. The South especially did not like the protective tariffs. Now, so looking at the Second National Bank, the charter for the First National Bank expired in 1811. State chartered banks and private banks issued their own paper money. Without a national bank to regulate currency, prices rose rapidly. The financial problems created by this inflation were enormous. Think kind of like we are right now, where everything just costs so much money. Inflation is a huge deal right now when you don't regulate our currency. And all this can go back to our stimulus that we got in 2020 and 2021. When you're having to print money to give to people, it's going to cause inflation because the value of that money is not as much as it was before. So to offset that, they have to raise prices. So all of this that we're dealing with is a lot of what they are dealing with at the time. In 1816, nationalistic Republicans approved a 20-year charter on a second bank of the United States. And this bank would assist economic growth, providing uniform currency, meaning one currency throughout the country set by one standard, a source for loans to the public and private sectors, and a place to deposit government funds. And then looking at some of the internal improvements that are proposed by the American system. These improvements were things such as roads, canals, harbors, railroads. Again, all physical things that aid in advancing the country. People can get to places easier. Goods can be shipped easier. So these internal improvements were the least successful aspect of the American system. President Madison and others believed that they lacked constitutional authority to fund such projects. Why should Maine, they reasoned, be taxed to pave a road in Maryland? Good questions, right? Roads and canals were the responsibility of the state or local area they served. Younger Republicans complained that the president's narrow views were hindering economic growth. Calhoun, for example, protested to the president that the Constitution was not intended as a thesis for the logician or philosopher to exercise his ingenuity on. It ought to be construed with plain good sense, meaning that the Constitution was not meant to be a verbatim word for word document that you can't vary from the left or right on. You should be able to use good common sense within the interpretation of this. He's saying that these internal improvements were good common sense for the betterment of the nation. So why should Maine pay for a road to be paved in Maryland? Because the goods from Maine might need to be shipped down through Maryland. And if they can't get there because they don't have a good paved road, then their economy is going to suffer. You have to look at the larger aspect of this. And all of these things are still problems that we have to deal with today. Thinking about our area, we have a hard time seeing why the state may raise taxes to build a road in Atlanta when we don't need that road in Toombs and Montgomery County. But how many times do we travel to Atlanta? And sometimes things have improved. A couple of years ago, they did a SPLOST tax that each individual region region could vote on for themselves. So like Toombs, Montgomery area voted in this East SPLOST tax. So we've been able to see a lot of improvements in our roads, but like the county that I grew up in, Cook County, they didn't pass it and their roads are terrible. And my mom and my grandparents, when they lived down there before they moved up here, were like, why are y'all's roads so much better than ours? Well, it's because we passed this East-SPLOST to be able to pay 1 more cent on the dollar, and we have better roads because of it. So there is a solution to these things that you can pass by region versus doing it overall, but it helps everybody. But one important step in these internal improvements was approved, and it was the building of the National Road. Constructed of the first part of this gravel road began in 1811 at Cumberland, Maryland. Lack of funding later halted construction. So you can see where this National Road went from Baltimore all the way over, Baltimore, Maryland, all the way over to Vandalia. Almost looks like Vidalia there. All right. Let's see. After considerable debate during the Madison years, Congress appropriated additional funds to extend the route to Wheeling, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia. Further funding in 1825 drove the road into the heart of the new Western states, reaching Vansville, Ohio, and by 1839 ending in Vandalia, Illinois. Today, motorists on Interstate 70 east of St. Louis travel basically the same route that pioneering families took in the 1830s by covered wagon, ox cart, or on foot. So that would be pretty neat to actually drive Interstate 70 up there from Baltimore to Vandalia and kind of go along the same route that these pioneers took. All right, so Panic of 1819. All this economic turmoil here with the tariffs and inflation is eventually going to rise up to be a problem with the economy. It's going to end up in a bust in our economy or a panic. So 2 unrelated events resulted in a depression called the Panic of 1819. First was the fall of cotton prices in England. Part of that was because of higher American prices and the introduction of inexpensive cotton from India. So as Britain was able to buy more cheaper cotton from India instead of buying the expensive cotton from America, the prices that the American farmer was getting in Britain dropped. So it led to a decline in demand for other American goods as well. And then the second unrelated event was the irresponsible actions of state banks and the National Bank. The opening of Western land purchases seemed to present a golden opportunity for banks to make loans to settlers and land speculators. Banks made a large number of loans to both groups. When the economy worsened, many people could not pay their loans, and some lost their homes and lands. Feud and scandal had occurred in the Bank of the U.S., and many people, particularly in the South and West, blamed it for the economic difficulties. In these regions, bitterness towards the National Bank grew. All right, so now we have a problem of a state wanting to become part of the Union. So in 1819, there was 11 slave states and 11 free states. So then Missouri applied for statehood, and their constitution permitted slavery. So this would create an unbalance in the Congress where there would be 12 slave states and 11 free states. And people didn't want that. So the question of political balance between the South and the North lay at the heart of the debate. The South, sometime before, had lost control of the House of Representatives to the more populous North. Balance in the Senate, therefore, remained critical to the region's political equality. So James Talmadge was a representative of New York. He proposed a resolution that prohibited slaveholders from bringing new slaves into Missouri. It also stated that the enslaved children born there after Missouri received statehood would attain freedom at the age of 25. This is a concept called gradual emancipation, meaning that you don't just come in at one point and wipe away slavery. It is slowly giving the slave owners time to find other sources of labor, but it has an end in sight and freedom for the slaves. The Talmadge Amendment brought an outcry from the slave states because it interfered with the state's laws, meaning that this would be a federal law that would override a state law. Furthermore, because slavery would be gradually eliminated there, it threatened the balance in the Senate. Voting along sectional lines, House members approved the Talmadge Amendment despite Southern objection. However, the amendment was defeated in the Senate. So then Maine applied for statehood, and Henry Clay's skillful handling of the controversy helped provide a compromise. And he came up with this Missouri Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, in 1820. And it proposed that Maine be admitted as a free state, because Maine is up there at the top of the country. It's in the north. Everything's free up there. So Maine would be admitted as a free state, Missouri as a slave state, and then the rest of the Louisiana Territory, slavery would not be permitted north of the 3630 line of latitude, which was Missouri's southern boundary. By a narrow margin, Congress approved the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri controversy exemplified the growing turmoil concerning the equality and liberty. Political lines were drawn between the regions, and with the ever-expanding Western settlement, Missouri represented a problem that would not soon go away. So this was in 1820, and just 40 short years, you would see the country coming to this controversy coming to a head, and the nation splitting, and we have our Civil War. So we're not far off from that time. So this is the Missouri Compromise, map of showing the Missouri Compromise. You would see these blue states up here are free. The brown are slaves. So if you look land-wise, there's more slave territory than there is free, but there's more people in the north. All right. And then another growing force during the first quarter of the 19th century, was increasing access to the political process. This idea of democratization, and I cannot pronounce that word, I just butchered it, but it's okay. This gave the average citizen a greater voice in the government, and they would now have greater equality in participation. So this was the emergence of universal manhood suffrage, or the right to vote for white men. Before this, people had to own property to be able to vote. So with doing away with this, that's one caveat there, that you had to own property. It opened up for any white man to be able to vote, regardless of whether they held property or not. And the people's gain of a greater voice in presidential elections. In the early years of the Republic, most electors in the Electoral College were chosen by their state's legislature. By the 1820s, however, the majority of the presidential electors was selected by popular vote, giving voters a greater influence in the choosing of their president. Even though increasing numbers of common people were able to vote, the electorate usually chose their leaders from the upper class, not from their own ranks. And then you have the fracturing of the one-party system and the emergence of a strong two-party system. Since Jefferson's 1800 victory, the Republicans had dominated national politics. In fact, the Federalists soon ceased even to be a threat in presidential contests. Without genuine competition, the single-party dominance made it seem that the national politics had returned to President Washington's ideal. Remember, Washington advocated for no parties. He didn't want there to be a division. But at this time, you kind of see that come back again. But then we start seeing a two-party system emerge. All right. So the death of King Caucus. So a caucus is a closed meeting of party leaders. This was a time when the elite basically got together and they chose their president and vice presidential candidates for their party. And after the Republicans became the dominant party, a handful of congressmen chose the president of the United States. 3 members of the Virginia dynasty, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, serving a total of 24 years, were elected by closed-door caucus method. Despite those impressive presidential choices, the reign of King Caucus understandably came under fire as undemocratic. As early as 1800, one newspaper criticized this fictitious meeting, this self-appointed, self-elected, self-delegated club or caucus or conspiracy, charging that about 24 men were deciding for the people of the United States who would be president and vice president. The 1824 election proved to be a political turning point in America. The caucus system of nominating candidates was completely discredited, and the divisive presidential campaign that year ended the idea of a nonpartisan government. So this election that's coming up in 1824 just proved to be a total disaster. There was too many people in, and it just made a huge spectacle almost of our country. So there were 4 men in this race as candidate in 1824. You had William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and General Andrew Jackson, all 4 great men. And they each appealed to different parts of the country. William Crawford was from Georgia. Then you had John Quincy Adams, who was the son of the former president and Monroe's Secretary of State. Then you had Kentuckian Henry Clay, and then you had the hero of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. So in this 4-way election, no candidate won a majority. So the election was decided by the House of Representatives as required by the 12th Amendment. So Clay, hold on, let me back up. So in the Electoral College tally, Jackson polled 99, Adams 84, Crawford 41, Clay 37. The popular vote, which we recorded for the first time and given in rounded figures, Jackson had 154,000 votes, Adams 109,000, Crawford 41,000, and Clay 48,000. Since no candidate had won a majority, the 12th Amendment required that the election be decided by the House of Representatives. So there, the president would be chosen from among the top 3 candidates from the Electoral College. So Henry Clay, he came in 4th, so he wouldn't even be in the running at this point for president. But he was in a unique position. He was the Speaker of the House at the time. So this vote is going into the House. He was the Speaker of this House. Speaker of the House. So he could decide who would be president. Clay preferred the nationalistic policies of Adams, and he considered Jackson unqualified. So Jackson at this point, he had won the popular vote. He had won the electoral vote, but he didn't have a majority in either. Second place was Adams. So this is why we're here in this unique voting situation in the House of Representatives. So Adams, Clay, because he preferred Adams' politics, chose Adams over Andrew Jackson, even though Andrew Jackson technically had won even without a majority. So Jackson supporters and Jackson himself were outraged. Of course they were. I mean, you should stick with what the people wanted. The people voted for Andrew Jackson. Electoral College voted for Andrew Jackson. He just didn't have that technical majority vote. So Clay should have went with Andrew Jackson, but he chose instead Adams. And then Adams made everything worse by nominating Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. And it just became a spectacle at this point. Jackson supporters accused him of making a corrupt bargain, which is an underhanded deal that gave Adams the presidency in return for making Clay Secretary of State. So Adams now, he is a brilliant political mind, but he had no hope going into the presidency like this. So Adams was an ineffective president. So before this, he had a distinguished political career, and he served capably in several offices. He was a Secretary of State under James Monroe. He dealt with purchases from Florida from Spain. He dealt with Britain, and he was one of the greatest Secretaries of State in history. He was brilliant, morally conscious, consistent, but he just didn't make a very good president. He had little patience for political maneuverings. He got that from his dad. He often did not understand the people he was asked to lead. In his first annual address to Congress, for example, Adams urged the members to support his proposal for internal improvement, saying that they should not fold up their arms and proclaim to the world that we are paralyzed by the will of our constituents. His seemingly low regard for voters strengthened the pro-Jackson's forces. So what he is saying here is that he realized some of the voters did not want these internal improvements, but he thought that the people in power should go over what the voters wanted and do what needed to be done. So he worked for higher protective tariffs and internal improvements. Adams' wing of the Democratic Republicans became known as the National Republicans. And the Jackson wing kept the old name, the Democrat Republicans, but eventually dropped the Republican part, keeping the name by which the party is still called the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party we have today is this Democratic Party of Jackson. So the candidates and perhaps the outcome of the 1828 election were probably determined 4 years earlier. It was an Adams-Jackson rematch. By that time, many of the former Crawford and Clay supporters had moved into the Jackson camp, including shrewd New York senator named Martin Van Buren. He helped organize a Democratic effort and urged Jackson to emphasize a symbolic campaign, Old Hickory, the friend of the common man. In the end, Jackson and his running mate, John C. Calhoun, won by landslide, getting 56% of the popular vote and an electoral tally of 178 to 83. For the first time, more than 1 million voters cast ballots for the presidency, which was triple the number in the 1824 election. In March 1829, record numbers attended the inauguration. And Jackson, when he won this presidency, he invited everyone to the inauguration, poor, whoever. So all of these people, celebrating crowds, poured into Washington, into the White House itself. They stripped wallpaper for souvenirs, scooped out globs of melting ice cream, and dripped trails of it on the carpet, smashed furniture and glass, gripped the hand of the mansion's newest occupant. Jackson, just before he slipped out a back door to lead the house to its fate. As one unamused observer grumbled, the reign of King Mob seemed triumph. So you've got all of these people coming in to see Jackson. He invited all, because he ran on this ticket of the common man. So everybody came to the White House, and they came pouring into the White House, basically destroying it. You had mobs, even though they were doing it not in a bad way. They're doing to celebrate his win. They're making a mockery out of it. Although it is true that the invading army of Jackson's supporters could be faulted for being a bit disorderly, they should also be credited with providing a fitting start to a new American era, the age of Jacksonian democracy, the age of the common man. All right, now we're going to look at Jackson's presidency, the Jackson years. The Democratic movement that won Jackson the presidency was underway before Old Hickory became his popular hero. By joining the movement, Jackson brought his fame to the national political stage. His remarkable life supplied more than enough material for this hero's image. By 1828, Jackson's biography read like a brief history of the United States. He was born in the Carolina backcountry in 1767. His parents were Scotch-Irish who had left Europe just 2 years before their son was born. His father died in an accident while clearing fields for spring planting, and 3 weeks later, his mother gave birth to a third son, giving him the name of her dead husband, which would end up being Andrew. His early life was rugged and difficult. At 13, he joined Patriot forces against the invading British, serving as a messenger. In April 1781, Andrew and his brother Robert were captured by British cavalry. When one of the officers ordered Andrew to clean his boots, Jackson refused. The enraged officer slashed the boy on his head with a sword and hacked at his raised arm. Jackson would bear the scars of his defiance for the remainder of his life. After the American Revolution, Jackson studied law and was admitted to the bar, meaning he was able to practice being a lawyer. He became a public prosecutor in the Tennessee Territory. He acquired land, slaves, horses, and a taste for politics. He became a state judge, and in 1796 was elected to a term in Congress. He had lots of flaws during his time before he won the presidency. He was straightforward, but sometimes harsh. His reputation was not made in Washington, however. It was made, oops, I missed where I was reading at, sorry. Where was I reading at? All right. It was forged on the frontier, fighting Indians and redcoats. General Jackson drove his men hard, but he drove himself harder. His grit earned him the admiration of his ranks. He's tough as Hickory, they would say, and so he was. That's where he got his name, Old Hickory. During the War of 1812, he ignored a treaty that had been negotiated with the Creek Indians. He confiscated huge portions of lands, even from those Creeks who aided him in the conflict. He led soldiers into Florida, then controlled by Spanish, in 1818. There he exceeded his orders and nearly caused a war with Spain. He was brutal in his treatment of the Seminole Indians in that region. In 1824, former President Jefferson said, "I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson become president. He is one of the most unfit men I know for such a place. He has had very little respect for laws or constitutions, though he is an able military chief." So we're looking at his presidency. There's several things that mark his presidency: the spoil system, his kitchen cabinet, the Nullification Crisis, busting up the national bank. These are his resentment for the Indians. These are all big things that mark his political career. His spoil system was where he replaced government office holders with his supporters. And this practice would continue for a long time after Jackson left office. So he would take people who were in government office, and whether they were qualified or not, would replace them with his friends, basically, whether they were qualified or not. And then he had his formal cabinet that is required by the Constitution. But instead of going to them for advice, he went to a circle of his close friends that his critics called his kitchen cabinet. It included newspaper editors, prominent Democrats in Congress, and his Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren, all political insiders. There was a lot of infighting among his administration, meaning fighting within his own people, especially between Martin Van Buren and Vice President John C. Calhoun. Van Buren increasingly sought the favor of President Jackson in an effort to limit Calhoun's influence. In addition, the sectional differences between the New Yorker and the South Carolinian heightened the dispute, particularly over the tariff question. Calhoun, who had been an ardent nationalist in the War of 1812, was becoming the major spokesman for the interests of the South. And then we have the Nullification Crisis. In 1828, Congress passed a new higher protective tariff with rates of up to 50% on some imports. The more industrialized North loved this tariff, but the South called it the tariff of abominations. It was bad for them. When you think of abomination, I always think of that word abominable, this abominable snowman like you see on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. This issue of nullification, excuse me, let me back up before we get to the issue of nullification. Southern leaders recognized the constitutional right of Congress to levy modest tariffs to raise revenue. However, they believed that these high protective tariffs were unconstitutional. So they believed that it was within the South's right to declare a law nullified, meaning to that a state could reject a congressional act that they saw as unconstitutional. That basically were taking the powers of these courts and applying it for their own selves. That they were saying that, okay, we don't like this law. We don't think this federal law is constitutional, so we're not going to follow it here within our state boundaries. We're going to declare this law as nullified. The issue of nullification was drawn from an anti-tariff pamphlet published unanimously by Vice President John C. Calhoun. So nullification of view that states can reject congressional acts that they deem unconstitutional. So with every issue, you've got two separate sides here. So you have Senator Robert Hayne. He rebuked New England's opposition to secession as an inconsistent since it had considered secession itself. Excuse me. So Hayne, he was from South Carolina, and he advocated for South Carolina seceding from the Union over this issue of tariffs, because New England at different times had also toyed with the idea of seceding from the Union because of different issues. And then you had Daniel Webster. He defended New England and insisted that the people of the United States had ratified the Constitution. Therefore, you should follow all parts of the Constitution. He declared it is the people's Constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people. Therefore, a state should neither secede nor nullify an act. His speech climaxed with the famous phrase, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable, meaning that to be free here in this country, to enjoy liberty, is to be part of this union. It is inseparable. These are both the same ideas. So therefore, a state could neither secede nor nullify an act. All of this came about to kind of come to a climax. John C. Calhoun ended up resigning as vice president, and he returned to the Senate to fight for states' rights. He and Jackson openly opposed each other on key issues. Senator Hayne resigned his Senate seat when he was elected governor of South Carolina. John C. Calhoun resigned as vice president to take Hayne's place on the Senate floor. Calhoun's resignation climaxed months of worsening relations between the president and vice president, a conflict that had become increasingly public. At a banquet in 1830, Jackson had pointedly looked at Calhoun as he raised a toast. Our Union must be preserved. Without missing a beat, Calhoun rose and presented his own toast. The Union next to our liberty, most dear. What they're saying here is Jackson is saying the Union is most important. We must do everything to preserve our Union. Calhoun is saying our freedom, our liberty is more important than the Union. Despite Calhoun's maneuvering, only a little sympathy and no support could be found for South Carolina's actions. An angry Andrew Jackson threatened to hang Calhoun and secure from Congress consideration and later passage of the Force Bill, which gave the president the power to use the military against South Carolina. Henry Clay, also known as the Great Compromise, he came up with the Great Compromise and all that. He proposed a new tariff that substantially, though gradually, reduced the tariff of 1832, making it acceptable to South Carolina. The proposed tariff, known as the Compromise Tariff of 1833, passed on March the 1st. In a parting shot to the president, though, South Carolina nullified the Force Bill. War had been averted, but there was little to cheer about. The crisis heightened tensions between the sections, and throughout the South, there was a growing uneasy sense of loss of control over their destiny. As one South Carolinian observed at the time of the Nullification Crisis, it is useless and impractical to disguise the fact that the South is in a permanent minority and that there is a sectional majority against it, a majority of different views and interests, and little common sympathy. All right, now we're going to look at Jackson going up against the Bank of the United States. So as it's time for Jackson to seek re-election for his second term, his major campaign issue was the future of the Bank of the United States. He had little understanding of banking practices, but had a distaste for banks themselves. The panic of 1819 was still vivid in the bitter memory in the West and the South, and the bank was the culprit in the minds of many Americans. In the summer of 1832, the president of the National Bank, Nicholas Biddle, submitted the bank's charter to Congress for a 20-year renewal, though the existing charter did not expire until 1836. When Jackson learned that his old political rival, Henry Clay, had instigated the early renewal of the charter, hoping it would help them to be elected president, Jackson said, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." The bank had such strong support in Congress that Clay believed he had a winning campaign issue. The recharter passed Congress, but Jackson vetoed it, claiming that it was unconstitutional. The Senate was unable to gain a 2/3 majority to override Jackson's veto, so the bank was to expire in 4 years. Clay thought the stage was now set for him to win a great victory. The election of 1832 produced 3 new political ideas. For the first time in a presidential election, a third party nominated a president. This was competition against the major political parties. And then you had a platform. This is a written statement describing where the party stood on various issues. And then, most importantly, it held a national convention where state delegates gathered to nominate the party's presidential and vice presidential candidates. Jackson swept to victory with his old ally Van Buren as his new vice president. Jackson appointed Roger B. Taney as Treasury Secretary in September of 1833. Two Secretary of Treasuries had refused to remove federal deposits from the U.S. Bank. So Jackson fired both of them and appointed Roger B. Taney. And the next month, Taney began removing federal deposits and placed them in the state banks, which became known as Jackson's pet banks, as his enemies called them. In 1836, when his charter expired, the Bank of the United States ceased to exist. And then looking at his problem with the Indians. In his first inaugural address in March of 1829, Jackson promised, "It will be my sincere and constant desire to be observed towards the Indian tribes within our limits, a just and liberal policy, and to give the humane and considerate attention to their rights and their wants, which is consistent with the habits of our government and the feelings of our people." But this wasn't always the case for him. The old Indian fighter that he was, people didn't expect him to be just towards the Indians. Even before Jackson took office, the U.S. had discussed moving all the Indian tribes in the east to lands west of the Mississippi and east of the Rockies. It seemed fair to the government since it wanted the Indian lands and did not want the western lands yet. They weren't really wanting that yet. The Indians, though, were not as impressed. They didn't think it was very fair. And then Jackson, when he took office, he pursued this Indian removal policy. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830 that authorized such actions. As a result, during his administration, no less than 94 treaties were made with the Indians, some of them forcibly. With the treaties as legal justification, the U.S. began moving the Indians westward and opened Indian lands to the east to white settlements. Sorry, I went a little faster. All right. So now we're going to look at Indian resistance. In 1832, a group of Sauk and Fox Indians under Chief Black Hawk crossed the Mississippi River back into northern Illinois to reclaim their land. The resulting Black Hawk War was brief but bloody. As with most U.S. Indian conflicts, the Indians suffered more and lost the war. More challenging was the Seminole War in 1835 to 1842. The Seminoles, led by Osceola, also resisted efforts to move them west. They hid in the swamplands and marshes of Florida as American troops tried in vain to track them down. Many battles and skirmishes occurred. Over 1,500 Americans and an unknown number of Indians died in the conflict. Most Seminoles were captured and sent west, but some hid in Florida until the government gave up and left them to live in peace. So this is why you have a large concentration of the Seminole Indians still in Florida. The Cherokees in the southeastern United States tried a different approach to their dealings with American settlers. They adopted many features of white civilization. They built communities with roads and schools and developed prosperous farms using European methods of agriculture. They also converted to Christianity. A brilliant Cherokee named Sequoyah even developed a written Cherokee alphabet, allowing the Indians to publish newspapers and the Bible in their own languages. Believing the earlier promises contained in their treaties with the U.S. that they would be left to govern themselves, the Cherokees resisted removal. They soon found that the Christian missionaries to their tribes were their strongest defenders. These leaders of the mission board had supported many of these missionaries to petition Congress and wrote many newspaper articles in support of the American rights. So two such of these missionaries lived among the Indians and they converted them over to Christianity. They were arrested for continuing their ministry among the Cherokee without approval from the Georgia legislature. They were sentenced to serve 4 years of hard labor in a state prison. Their names were Samuel Worcester and Elijah Butler. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the missionaries. So in the case that became known as Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ordered Georgia to release the missionaries and also told President Jackson to send troops into Georgia to remove white settlers who had moved in the Cherokee lands. But Georgia and President Jackson ignored the court. Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," knowing that the court had no way of enforcing their decisions. Many Cherokees still resisted. But by 1838, troops had forcibly moved those who had not already gone west to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. U.S. soldiers dragged the Cherokees from their homes, sometimes at gunpoint, and placed them in detention camps until the marches west began. These marches began in summer, and sickness and drought killed many of the travelers. Several groups waited until fall, but heavy rains became a problem. Travel was difficult and food was scarce. As winter set in, frigid weather and bad water caused more disease. About 4,000 of 15,000 Cherokees died en route to the Indian Territory. The sick, the aged, and the very young suffered the most. The Indians called the relocation the Trail of Tears. All right, looking at the last section in this chapter, we're going to be looking at party politics. It's not as long as the other section, so it shouldn't take us long to go through it. All right, so Jackson and anti-Jackson. You basically had two groups here, those who supported Jackson and those who were against Jackson. And as Jackson's second term went on, this force that was against Jackson grew. They formed a political alliance in the early 1830s that became known as the Whig Party. So basically, their whole idea was to do away with Jackson. So they call Andrew Jackson King Andrew I, meaning he was taking away a lot of people's democracy. They were taking away their liberty for his own gain. He insisted that he did not have a monopoly on the common man's support, meaning that they could gain the common man's support as well as he could. These are some of the different ideas of the two different groups. We're going to skip over this. So the election of 1836 comes up. Jackson holds with the two-term tradition and doesn't run for president, but he supports his Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. The Whig candidate was Daniel Webster. They also had William Henry Harrison, which is not a good idea for one party to have two different candidates in the same election because you're going to end up splitting your votes. In this case, they had a third one, Hugh White. Jackson's endorsement was really the deciding vote in Van Buren's favor. So Van Buren won the election. Just weeks after Van Buren took office, the economy collapsed, pulling the country into a deep 5-year depression known as the Panic of 1837. Banks and businesses failed, and unemployment grew across the nation. So we're going to look at some of the causes of this panic. And a lot of them had to deal with Jackson's economic policies. His malpractice worsening through it did not cause all the problems of the ailing economy. Malpractice meaning things he did wrong. A lot of times we think of medical malpractice. These are things that doctors do wrong. You can have malpractices in other places. Wild, irresponsible practices among the state banks, as well as massive wheat crop failure and collapse of cotton prices, brought the economy to its knees. One historian argued that Jackson's short-sighted financial measures had sown the wind, and Van Buren was to reap the whirlwind. So Van Buren proposed an independent treasury to replace the state's banks as a depository for federal funds. The treasury was to only have federal funds deposited in it, and only government employees were to manage it. Sub-treasuries were planned for major cities throughout the nation. Van Buren's proposal was often called the sub-treasury system. This system would separate private banks from federal funds. The plan was proposed in 1837, but because of opposition, Congress did not pass it until 1840. The 1840 presidential campaign was one of the most colorful in our nation's history, a remarkable fact considering the rather dull candidates as the two parties offered the country. So the Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, who was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. So they reasoned that if they couldn't beat them, learn from them. So they learned from what the Democrats did while in office. So Harrison, his vice president running on the same ticket as him was John Tyler, and their slogan became Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The Whigs presented Harrison as a humble yet heroic backwoodsman symbolized by a log cabin, trying to appeal to this common man theory. So the most famous campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So Harrison won, and he delivered the longest inauguration speech in American history. On that dreary cold day of March the 4th, 1841, old Tippecanoe stood on the east steps of the Capitol and read his speech for nearly 2 hours. Despite it being cold and rainy, he didn't wear an overcoat or a hat. And then he rode through the streets in the inaugural parade and attended 3 different balls. The 68-year-old general was not well as it was. And in the days after he moved into the White House, he found the flood of office seekers trying to take advantage of his success overwhelming. Besides, his wife, Anna, was back home in Ohio. She had not been well enough to join him on the difficult journey by steamboat, stagecoach, and trains to Washington. As a result, the White House was simply not in order. In the chill spring rain, he journeyed to the fish market and the butcher shop to stock the White House cupboards. A cold that had nagged him since his inaugural speech worsened. In that speech, he had pointedly declared himself to be a one-term president. Ironically, he was to be a one-month president. Stricken with pneumonia on April the 1st, Harrison died 3 days later, a bare month after taking office. He was the first president to die while in office. The president's death stunned the nation. Harrison's larger-than-life campaign image suddenly turned mortal. The oldest president yet elected was now replaced by the youngest president yet to serve. The nation now faced its future under the leadership of John Tyler, age 51, a man whom most had never expected would actually govern. And that is where we will leave off. And we will pick up with chapter 11 later. Y'all listen to Miss Wise and do what you're supposed to do. And I appreciate y'all keeping up and doing everything. Y'all have a good rest of your day.